You do not live here, ma'am, so I am asking you one last time to leave." The words echoed across the quiet suburban street so loudly that several neighbors turned to look through their front windows. Danielle Carter stopped halfway up the walkway leading to her own front door. 2 grocery bags rested in her hands. A carton of milk pressed against one side. Fresh vegetables peeked from the top of the other. For a moment, she honestly wondered whether she had heard the officer correctly. The afternoon sun hung low above the tree-lined neighborhood, casting long shadows across neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences. Children rode bicycles 2 blocks away. A lawn sprinkler clicked steadily across a patch of green grass. Everything about the street felt peaceful except for the patrol vehicle parked at the curb and the uniformed officer standing between Danielle and her home. Officer Bradley Owens folded his arms across his chest. His expression suggested that he had already reached a conclusion. "Sir," Danielle said calmly, "I have lived here for 11 years. She nodded toward the blue 2-story house directly behind her. "That is my home." Bradley glanced at the house and then back at her. "I am not interested in stories right now. I am interested in facts." Danielle felt several eyes watching from nearby windows. Curtains shifted. Front doors opened. Neighbors stepped onto porches pretending not to stare while staring at everything. She took a slow breath. "The facts are that I own this house." Bradley shook his head. "Then proving that should be easy." Danielle looked down at the grocery bags in her hands. She had spent the morning preparing lesson plans for her 3rd-grade students. The school year was only a few weeks away. Her biggest concern 30 minutes earlier had been deciding what to cook for dinner. Now she was standing in front of her own home, being questioned as though she did not belong there. A teenager walking a dog slowed down across the street. An elderly couple paused their afternoon walk. The atmosphere shifted. People sensed something uncomfortable unfolding. Bradley pointed toward the sidewalk. "Please remain where you are." Danielle set the grocery bags down carefully near the walkway. The milk carton wobbled slightly before settling. She kept her voice respectful. "Officer, may I ask why this is happening?" Bradley glanced toward his patrol car. "We received a report regarding suspicious activity in this area." Danielle blinked. "Suspicious activity?" "Yes. And what exactly did I do?" The officer hesitated for a second. "Not long enough for most people to notice. Long enough for Danielle to notice. We are still determining that." Several neighbors exchanged confused looks. Danielle could feel embarrassment slowly spreading through her chest, but she refused to let it show. Her father had always taught her that dignity mattered most when circumstances felt unfair. Across the street, another front door opened. More people stepped outside. Phones appeared. Quiet conversations began. Bradley remained convinced he was in control of the situation. Danielle remained determined not to lose her composure. Neither of them realized that from a shaded porch halfway down the block, a man and a German shepherd had already been watching everything from the very beginning. Danielle Carter had spent most of her life learning how to remain calm when other people rushed to conclusions. Standing on the walkway outside her own home, she felt the familiar pressure of being watched, judged, and quietly misunderstood. Yet her expression never changed. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall maple trees lining the street, painting moving patterns across the sidewalks and neatly trimmed lawns. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Peaceful, familiar, safe. Danielle knew nearly every family on the block. She knew which children needed extra help with reading. She knew which elderly neighbors appreciated someone checking on them after storms. She knew who left cookies on doorsteps during the holidays and who organized community cleanups every spring. For 11 years, this street had been more than an address. It had been home. Across the road, Mrs. Henderson stood on her porch holding a watering can. She had known Danielle since the day the moving truck first arrived. 2 houses down, a young father paused while mowing his lawn and watched the scene unfold with visible confusion. The people who actually lived there recognized Danielle immediately. That was what made the situation feel so strange. Officer Bradley Owens continued standing beside his patrol vehicle, convinced that he was asking reasonable questions. To Danielle, however, the questions felt disconnected from reality. She glanced toward her front porch where a small wind chime moved gently in the breeze. A flower basket she had planted earlier that summer hung beside the door. Her welcome mat rested exactly where it always had. Every detail around her reflected years of memories and routines. yet somehow she was being treated as though she were a stranger. "Officer," she said politely, "if there is a misunderstanding, I would like to help clear it up." Bradley nodded but remained guarded. "That is exactly what we are doing." Danielle noticed several more neighbors gathering near the sidewalks. Nobody appeared angry. Most simply looked concerned. The atmosphere carried an uncomfortable tension that did not belong in a neighborhood where people normally greeted one another by name. Danielle thought briefly about the stack of lesson plans waiting inside her house. In less than a month, her classroom would be full again. New students, new challenges, new opportunities to encourage children who often doubted themselves. Teaching had never made her wealthy, but it had given her purpose. She believed deeply in treating people with patience, especially when patience felt difficult. That belief was being tested now. A breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the neighborhood. Somewhere nearby, a basketball bounced rhythmically on a driveway. Ordinary sounds, ordinary moments. Yet all of them seemed distant beneath the weight of dozens of eyes watching a situation that should never have existed. Danielle folded her hands calmly and waited. She did not know how long the misunderstanding would continue. She only knew that losing her dignity would not help. What she did not realize was that from a shaded porch farther down the street, a retired Navy SEAL and a highly trained German Shepherd were still observing every word, every reaction, and every detail unfolding before them. Officer Bradley Owens had always trusted his instincts more than explanations. That confidence had carried him through nearly 2 decades in law enforcement, and over time it had hardened into something he rarely questioned. Standing in the middle of the quiet neighborhood, he watched Danielle Carter with growing certainty, even though the facts in front of him refused to fit neatly together. The house behind her looked lived in. The flower beds were well maintained. A silver sedan sat in the driveway. Her name appeared on a package resting near the front door. Yet instead of reconsidering his assumptions, Bradley focused on the one thing that continued bothering him. He did not recognize her. To him, that felt important. More important than it should have. "You said you have lived here 11 years?" he asked. Danielle nodded. "That is correct." Bradley glanced up and down the street. "And you expect me to believe nobody has ever reported concerns before?" Danielle remained calm. "You would have to ask my neighbors." Several of those neighbors exchanged puzzled looks. Mrs. Henderson stepped off her porch as if she wanted to say something, then stopped. Others remained silent. Not because they agreed with Bradley, because they were unsure whether speaking up would make the situation worse. The tension spreading across the block felt unfamiliar. Children who had been playing basketball at the end of the street stopped bouncing the ball. A young couple walking their dog paused near the sidewalk. More phones appeared. More people watched. Bradley noticed the growing audience and interpreted it as validation. In his mind, public attention often meant he was uncovering something important. He failed to recognize that most people were gathering because they sensed an injustice unfolding. Danielle glanced toward her front porch again. The grocery bags still sat where she had placed them. The milk carton reflected the sunlight. Ice cream inside one of the bags would not stay frozen much longer. Under normal circumstances, it would have been an ordinary inconvenience. Today it felt symbolic. Her entire life had been interrupted by a misunderstanding that should have ended minutes ago. "Officer," she said gently, "if you would like identification, I can provide it." Bradley hesitated. For a brief moment, the offer should have resolved everything. Instead, he folded his arms tighter. "We are not there yet." Danielle blinked. The answer made little sense. Even several neighbors frowned. A warm breeze moved through the trees overhead, scattering leaves across the pavement. Somewhere farther down the street, a screen door opened and closed. The neighborhood continued its normal rhythms, yet the center of attention remained fixed on the walkway in front of Danielle's home. Bradley looked around again, determined not to back down. What he did not realize was that every passing minute was strengthening the memories of every witness watching him. And from the shaded porch across the street, the retired Navy SEAL sitting beside a German Shepherd continued observing quietly, saying nothing, missing nothing, while a small security camera mounted beneath the porch roof captured every second in perfect clarity. The longer the situation continued, the more uncomfortable the neighborhood became. What had started as a brief interruption now felt like a public spectacle unfolding in slow motion. Danielle Carter remained standing near the walkway to her house, while Officer Bradley Owens continued asking questions that seemed to lead nowhere. The afternoon sun drifted lower behind the trees, covering parts of the street in long bands of gold and shadow. Several neighbors had stopped pretending they were not watching. Mrs. Henderson finally crossed her lawn and stood near the sidewalk. A father who had been mowing his grass shut off the mower completely. Two teenagers sat on their bicycles at the corner, quietly observing every word. Danielle could feel dozens of eyes on her, yet she refused to show frustration. "Officer," she said carefully, "I have answered every question you have asked. Is there something specific you believe I have done wrong?" Bradley glanced toward the growing crowd before looking back at her. "I am trying to determine whether you belong here." The words landed heavily. A ripple moved through the neighbors. Several people exchanged shocked looks. Danielle felt her chest tighten for the first time that afternoon. Not because she was afraid, because she could not believe what she was hearing. She slowly looked around the neighborhood she had called home for more than a decade. The maple tree she had planted during her second year on the block stood near the driveway. The mailbox she painted herself years earlier sat beside the curb. The porch where she graded student assignments on warm evenings was only a few feet away. Yet somehow she was being asked whether she belonged. "This is my neighborhood," she replied softly. Bradley shook his head as if he remained unconvinced. "That remains to be seen." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. A woman standing across the street quietly lowered her phone. Another neighbor frowned openly. Even people who barely knew Danielle appeared increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Bradley seemed unaware of the effect his words were having. The more resistance he sensed from the crowd, the more determined he became to prove himself right. Danielle noticed the ice cream in one of the grocery bags beginning to soften. Under different circumstances, she might have laughed at the absurdity of worrying about melting ice cream during such a strange moment. Instead, she focused on staying composed. Her students often looked to her for calm during difficult situations. She reminded herself that character was measured during uncomfortable moments, not easy ones. A warm gust of wind moved through the neighborhood. Leaves rustled overhead. Wind chimes rang softly from several porches. The peaceful sounds seemed completely disconnected from the tension gathering on the street. Then something changed. Across the road, a large German shepherd slowly stood from a shaded porch and looked toward the scene. Beside the dog, a man remained seated in a wooden chair, quietly watching. He had not spoken once. He had not intervened. Yet there was something about the stillness of both the man and the dog that drew attention. Danielle noticed them. Bradley did not. Neither realized that the moment everyone would remember was now much closer than anyone expected. The neighborhood had reached a point where nobody could pretend this was a simple misunderstanding anymore. What should have been a brief conversation had turned into a public test of dignity, and everyone standing on the street could feel it. Danielle Carter remained beside the walkway leading to her home, while Officer Bradley Owens stood near the curb, convinced that backing down now would make him appear uncertain. The late afternoon sunlight had softened into a warm amber glow, casting long shadows across the lawns and sidewalks. The grocery bags still rested where Danielle had placed them nearly half an hour earlier. A small puddle of melted ice cream had begun forming inside one of the bags. It was a tiny detail, but somehow it made the entire situation feel even more unfair. Danielle looked toward her front door only a few yards away. Home had never felt so distant. "Officer," she said quietly, making one final attempt to resolve the situation peacefully. "I have answered your questions. My neighbors know me. My house is right here. What exactly are you asking me to prove?" Bradley looked around at the growing crowd before answering. "I am asking you to cooperate until I am satisfied that everything checks out." The response triggered visible reactions. Mrs. Henderson shook her head. The father who had stopped mowing his lawn folded his arms. A teenager standing beside a bicycle whispered something to a friend. The mood of the neighborhood was changing. People were no longer merely curious. They were beginning to feel uncomfortable. Danielle could sense it too. She felt the weight of every phone camera pointed in her direction. Every glance. Every whispered conversation. Being questioned was one thing. Being publicly doubted in front of the community she had served for years was something entirely different. Yet she refused to lose control. "I have lived here for 11 years, she repeated calmly. "I teach at Jefferson Elementary. Many of these people know me personally." Bradley remained unmoved. That does not answer my concerns. The statement hung in the air. Several neighbors exchanged stunned looks. Even those who had remained silent until now appeared unsure how to react. Danielle felt a brief flash of disappointment. Not anger. Disappointment. She had spent years helping children believe they belonged in classrooms where they sometimes felt invisible. Now she was standing in her own neighborhood, hearing someone question whether she belonged here at all. A gentle wind moved through the trees overhead. Wind chimes echoed softly from nearby porches. The peaceful sounds only made the tension feel sharper. Then the German shepherd across the street stepped down from the shaded porch and sat at the edge of the lawn, alert and observant. The dog never barked, never moved aggressively. It simply watched. Beside it, the quiet man finally stood from his chair. He stretched slowly and looked toward the gathering crowd. Several neighbors noticed him immediately. Danielle noticed him too. Bradley remained focused on proving himself right. The man and the dog began walking toward the street with calm, deliberate steps. Neither appeared rushed. Neither appeared concerned. Yet something about their presence caused conversations to fade and heads to turn. Without realizing it, everyone on the block was beginning to look away from the confrontation and toward the silent witness who had seen everything. The neighborhood grew unusually quiet as the man and the German shepherd continued walking toward the center of the street. No one seemed to know exactly why their arrival mattered, yet conversations faded almost instinctively. The dog moved with calm discipline, its ears alert but relaxed, staying close to its owner's side. The man carried himself with the kind of confidence that did not need attention. He wore a simple gray shirt, faded jeans, and a baseball cap that shaded part of his face. Nothing about him appeared dramatic, yet somehow his presence changed the atmosphere. Danielle Carter noticed it immediately. Standing near her walkway, she felt the tension that had surrounded her for nearly an hour begin to shift. Not disappear. Shift. The late afternoon. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden patterns across the pavement. Leaves rustled softly overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically back and forth. The ordinary sounds of the neighborhood suddenly seemed louder because nobody was speaking. Officer Bradley Owens remained focused on Danielle, unaware that more and more attention was moving away from him. His certainty still felt intact. He had convinced himself that patience would eventually prove him right. The crowd, however, no longer looked at him with curiosity. They looked at him with concern. Mrs. Henderson folded her arms quietly. The father near the driveway stared at the ground for a moment before glancing toward the approaching man. Even the teenagers with bicycles had stopped whispering. Danielle took a slow breath and looked toward her front porch. The flower basket beside her door swayed gently in the breeze. The sight reminded her why she had worked so hard all those years. Everything she cared about was here. Her home, her neighbors, her students who often visited during community events. Her life had roots in this neighborhood deeper than most people realized. The humiliation of being questioned in front of everyone still hurt, but she refused to allow bitterness to take hold. Her father used to say that character revealed itself most clearly when nobody expected kindness. Danielle thought about those words now. Across the street, the German shepherd stopped briefly and sat beside the curb. The man rested one hand lightly on the dog's shoulder while looking toward the gathering crowd. His expression remained unreadable, calm, observant, patient. He seemed less interested in speaking than in understanding. The sunlight caught a small security camera mounted beneath the roofline of his porch. Few people noticed it. Danielle did. The camera had been there for years, quietly recording ordinary days. Children riding bicycles, neighbors walking dogs, families returning home from work. Today had not been an ordinary day. A cool breeze swept through the neighborhood once more. Wind chimes echoed softly from several homes at once. For a moment, everything felt suspended between two different outcomes. One path led deeper into misunderstanding. The other led toward truth. Nobody knew which direction events would take. But as the man and his dog resumed walking toward the crowd, one thing became increasingly clear. The waiting was almost over. The man stopped a few feet from the gathering crowd and quietly rested his hand on the German shepherd's back. The dog sat calmly beside him, watching the scene with disciplined focus. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence itself seemed to command attention. Officer Bradley Owens finally turned toward the newcomer. "Sir, this is an active situation," he said. I need you to remain back. The man nodded politely. I understand. His voice was calm and measured. I only have a question. Bradley frowned slightly. What question? The man glanced toward Danielle Carter, then toward the neighbors lining the street. How long has this been going on? No one answered immediately. Mrs. Henderson finally spoke from the sidewalk. Nearly an hour. Several heads nodded. The man's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened. He looked back at Bradley. And during that hour, has she done anything threatening? That is not the issue, Bradley replied. Has she refused to cooperate? The man asked. Bradley hesitated. No. Has she attempted to leave? No. Has she identified this house as her residence? Yes. The questions arrived one after another with quiet precision. The crowd listened carefully. Danielle remained silent. She had no idea where this was leading, but for the first time all afternoon, she sensed that someone was finally looking at the facts instead of assumptions. Bradley crossed his arms. Who exactly are you? The man smiled faintly. My name is Michael Hayes. A few neighbors immediately recognized the name. Bradley did not. Michael gently scratched the German shepherd behind the ears. I live across the street. Bradley nodded as though the answer settled nothing. Then I suggest you let me handle this. Michael looked toward his porch. The small security camera mounted beneath the roofline reflected a flash of sunlight. Then he returned his attention to Bradley. Normally I would. He paused briefly. But today I have something relevant. The neighborhood became completely still. Even the children at the far end of the block had stopped moving. Michael reached into his pocket and removed a phone. My security system records continuously, he said. Multiple angles. Audio and video. Bradley's confidence faltered for the first time. Danielle looked toward the camera on the porch and suddenly understood why Michael had remained silent for so long. He had not needed to argue. He had not needed to interrupt. He had simply been watching, recording, waiting. Michael glanced toward Danielle and offered a respectful nod. Then he looked back at Bradley. The footage shows exactly when she arrived home. It shows what she was carrying. It shows every conversation that followed. The crowd exchanged excited whispers. Phones rose higher. Mrs. Henderson covered her mouth. Bradley stared at Michael's phone as though realizing something important far too late. Then Michael delivered the sentence that changed everything. And before anyone asks, he said calmly, I spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL. Observing details before reaching conclusions was literally my job. The silence that followed felt even heavier than before, because everyone on the street suddenly understood that the truth was no longer a matter of opinion. It was about to become visible for everyone to see. For several seconds after Michael Hayes finished speaking, nobody on the street moved. The neighborhood seemed frozen between disbelief and anticipation. Officer Bradley Owens stared at the phone in Michael's hand, while the German shepherd sat quietly beside its owner, calm and attentive. The confidence that had carried Bradley through the afternoon was beginning to slip away. Around him, neighbors exchanged glances. They had all witnessed pieces of the situation unfold, but now there was something different. There was evidence. Michael unlocked his phone and opened a series of recorded clips from the security system mounted on his porch. The first video showed Danielle Carter arriving home with grocery bags in her hands. The timestamp was visible. The footage was clear. It showed her parking her car in her driveway, retrieving her groceries, and walking toward her front door. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. Just a homeowner returning home after a normal day. Michael swiped to another clip. This one showed the moment Bradley arrived. The crowd watched silently as the recording captured Danielle's calm responses and respectful tone. Again and again, the footage showed her attempting to cooperate. Again and again, it showed her identifying the house as her residence. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. The truth was speaking for itself. Bradley's shoulders lowered slightly. For the first time all afternoon, he looked less like an authority figure and more like a man confronting a difficult realization. Mrs. Henderson quietly shook her head. The father near the driveway looked down at the pavement. Several neighbors who had remained silent earlier now seemed relieved that the uncertainty was ending. Danielle stood quietly near her walkway. She felt no satisfaction watching Bradley struggle. Only sadness. Sadness that something so simple had become so public. Michael placed the phone back into his pocket. The footage confirms what everyone here already knew, he said calmly. She belongs here. The statement settled over the neighborhood like a final verdict. No dramatic reaction followed. No cheering. No celebration. Just silence. Honest silence. Bradley looked toward Danielle. The crowd watched carefully. The late afternoon sun reflected softly from nearby windows, bathing the street in warm golden light. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. "Miss Carter," Bradley said quietly. The firmness in his voice had disappeared. "I owe you an apology." Danielle met his eyes, but said nothing. Bradley continued. "I should have listened more carefully. I should have looked at the facts before drawing conclusions." His words were not perfect. They were not polished. But they were sincere. Danielle looked around at the neighbors who had gathered. People she knew. People she cared about. Then she looked back at Bradley. "We all make mistakes," she said gently. "What matters is whether we learn from them." The crowd relaxed almost immediately. Tension that had lingered for nearly an hour finally began to dissolve. Bradley nodded slowly. The lesson was not easy, but he understood it. Michael glanced toward Danielle with quiet respect. The German shepherd remained seated, completely still. Above them, the leaves moved softly in the evening breeze. The misunderstanding was ending, but the memory of how it ended would remain with everyone who had witnessed it. Several weeks later, the neighborhood gathered for its annual community block party beneath a clear autumn sky. Folding tables lined the street. Children raced between lawn chairs carrying paper plates filled with food. Music drifted softly from a portable speaker near the center of the block. The atmosphere felt warm, familiar, and peaceful. Danielle Carter stood near a table helping several children decorate posters for an upcoming school project. Their laughter carried through the afternoon air. Watching them smile reminded her why she had chosen teaching in the first place. Small moments often mattered more than grand ones. Around her, neighbors talked easily with one another. Mrs. Henderson handed out homemade cookies. Families shared stories. The tension that had once settled over the street seemed impossible to imagine now. Yet nobody had forgotten what happened that afternoon. They had simply chosen to learn from it instead of allowing it to divide them. Across the street, Michael Hayes stood beneath the shade of a large maple tree while Rex rested calmly beside him. Several neighbors had stopped to thank him over the past few weeks. Each time, he gave the same simple answer. He had only done what any good neighbor should do. Michael never seemed interested in recognition. He preferred quiet actions over public attention. Rex remained the unofficial favorite of every child on the block. One by one, children approached to pet the German shepherd, and the dog accepted every greeting with patient dignity. Danielle smiled as she watched. The sight made the entire neighborhood feel stronger somehow. A short distance away, Officer Bradley Owens walked through the gathering carrying a tray of bottled water he had volunteered to bring. The change in him was subtle but noticeable. He spoke less, listened more. Several neighbors greeted him politely, and he returned every greeting with genuine respect. Growth rarely happened all at once. More often, it appeared in small choices repeated day after day. Bradley understood that now. At one point his eyes met Danielle's across the street. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then Danielle offered a simple nod. Bradley returned it. Nothing more was necessary. The lesson between them had already been learned. As the afternoon slowly turned toward evening, golden sunlight settled across the neighborhood. The trees glowed with shades of amber and gold. Wind moved gently through the leaves overhead. Children continued laughing. Neighbors continued talking. Life continued moving forward. Danielle stepped away from the activity for a moment and looked down the street she had called home for more than a decade. The houses stood quietly beneath the fading light. Front porches glowed warmly. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had, yet something felt different, stronger, more connected. Across the road, Michael clipped a leash onto Rex and began walking home. Bradley helped an elderly neighbor carry folding chairs. Danielle listened to the distant sound of children playing and felt a quiet sense of gratitude settle over her heart. The sun disappeared beyond the rooftops, leaving only soft evening light behind. No speeches followed. No dramatic endings arrived. Only the peaceful silence of a community learning how to see one another a little more clearly than before.